It started with a threat from the White House, followed by an insult that struck at the heart of a nation's identity. In response to President Trump's economic pressure, a stunning popular revolt has been unleashed across Canada, from provincial premiers banning American products to everyday shoppers refusing to buy US goods. A nationwide boycott has taken hold. A nation of 40 million people is fighting back, not with tariffs, but with their wallets. The world's friendliest border has become an economic battleground. What happens when a quiet neighbor decides it has had enough? The relationship was often described as the closest between any two countries on Earth. It was less a border, more a shared backyard. For generations, the flow of people, goods, and culture was seamless. Canadians vacationed in Florida, shopped in Buffalo, and consumed American entertainment as if it were their own. US brands like Coca-Cola, Ford, and Amazon weren't just present in Canada, they were part of the national fabric. This deep integration, built on a perception of shared values and mutual respect, created a unique bond where conflict seemed almost unthinkable. But in early 2025, that long-standing pact of friendship was shattered by a 1-2 punch of economic threat and national insult. President Donald Trump, seeking leverage in broader trade disputes, didn't just threaten Canada with crippling 25% tariffs. He deployed inflammatory rhetoric, reportedly referring to Canada as a potential 51st state. To Washington, this may have been transactional bluster, a negotiating tactic. To Canadians, it was a profound violation. The comments struck a raw nerve, tapping into a deep-seated fear of being overshadowed by their powerful neighbor and erasing their distinct national identity. It transformed a policy disagreement into a deeply personal affront. Suddenly, buying American wasn't just a consumer choice, it became a political statement. The quiet, friendly neighbor was being told it didn't just have an unfair economy, it lacked sovereignty itself. This was the spark that would ignite a firestorm of consumer and political blowback. In early February 2025, the Trump administration deployed its signature weapon, economic shock and awe. The announcement of a potential 25% tariff on most Canadian goods was a direct threat to the heart of Canada's economy. But this wasn't just a policy move, it was part of a calculated psychological campaign. The tariffs were the hammer, but the rhetoric was the poison. Washington's strategy was rooted in a belief that Canada, as the smaller, more dependent partner, would ultimately have no choice but to fold under overwhelming pressure. The administration sought to leverage its economic power to force concessions on a range of trade files, and it believed that an aggressive take-no-prisoners approach was the fastest way to achieve its goals. Then came the insult that would pour gasoline on the fire. Reports surfaced of Trump's inflammatory rhetoric, including musings about annexing the country and calling Canada the 51st state. From the White House's perspective, this may have been seen as off-the-cuff bluster or a hardball negotiating tactic, a way to diminish Canada's standing and signal that it would not be treated as an equal. It was a projection of dominance designed to intimidate and destabilize. The underlying assumption was that Canada, faced with economic ruin and public humiliation, would quickly seek a deal at any cost. Washington fundamentally misread the Canadian psyche, viewing the country's historic politeness as a sign of weakness. The administration believed it could dictate terms, rewrite agreements, and insult its closest ally with impunity, expecting little more than a resigned sigh in return. It was a gambit built on a profound misunderstanding of its neighbor, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. The reaction in Canada was not submission. It was a sudden, unified, and furious roar. The combination of economic threat and national insult galvanized the country in a way not seen in generations. The response was led from the very top. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, abandoning diplomatic niceties, issued a direct call to arms to his citizens, urging them to choose Canada and consciously reject American goods and travel plans. It was a clear signal. This was no longer a government dispute. It was a national cause. What happened next was unprecedented. For the first time in history, all 13 of Canada's provincial and territorial premiers presented a united front. They traveled together to Washington, D.C., not to beg for mercy, but to deliver a coordinated message of strength and advocate for the deeply integrated relationship their American counterparts seemed ready to demolish. But their actions back home spoke even louder. This wasn't just talk, it was immediate, tangible economic retaliation. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford, a conservative populist often seen as politically aligned with Trump, ordered the province's liquor board to halt the sale of U.S. alcohol, declaring that when attacked, Canada hits back. British Columbia and Quebec quickly followed suit. Quebec's premier, François Legault, went further, ordering a review of all government procurement contracts to find ways to penalize U.S. suppliers. On the East Coast, Nova Scotia doubled the road tolls for U.S. registered vehicles. This political leadership unleashed a tidal wave of consumer activism. The Buy Canadian movement exploded from a niche sentiment into a national phenomenon. An Angus Reid poll revealed the staggering scale of the shift. 98% of Canadians were now actively looking for Made in Canada labels. 85% were consciously replacing American products with domestic alternatives wherever possible. It became a daily act of patriotic defiance. Apps like MapleScan, which allowed shoppers to identify the origin of a product, saw a massive surge in downloads. The boycott was both broad and specific, with reports of consumers shunning everything from Netflix and Amazon to California wines and Kentucky bourbon. The cultural backlash was just as potent. In a deeply symbolic act of protest, fans began booing the U.S. national anthem at sporting events. The insult of being called the 51st state was met with a defiant embrace of Canadian identity. The world's friendliest border had become the front line in a people-powered economic war. This leaves the two nations in a bitter and unprecedented standoff. President Trump's administration, having used inflammatory rhetoric and threats as its primary tools, is now faced with a unified political and popular revolt. To back down now would be a significant political defeat, undermining its entire America First negotiating posture. Yet, to escalate further risks, deepening the economic self-harm caused by the boycott. On the other side, Canada has rediscovered a fierce sense of national pride and economic sovereignty. Its leaders and citizens are united, but this unity comes at a cost, straining supply chains and forcing a difficult decoupling from its largest trading partner. The boycott is a powerful weapon, but it's one that creates economic disruption at home as well. The two neighbors, bound by history, geography, and trillions of dollars in trade, are now locked in a confrontation fueled by pride and principle, with no obvious path back to the way things were. In Canada, the boycott became a powerful symbol of national unity, a way for citizens to feel they were fighting back. But this patriotic stand is not without its own internal cost. For a restaurant owner in Vancouver or a pub owner in Halifax, joining the movement meant making a difficult business decision. Taking popular American spirits off the menu was a statement, but it also meant telling regular customers they could no longer order their favorite Kentucky bourbon or California Cabernet. While many patrons embraced Canadian alternatives, the data reveals a more complicated truth. Between March and April, sales of U.S. spirits in Canada plummeted by a staggering 66.3%, with some Ontario retailers reporting an 80% decline. Yet, overall spirit sales in the country still fell by roughly 13%. This indicates that consumers didn't just seamlessly switch from American to Canadian products. The entire market contracted. This is the calculated sacrifice at the heart of the boycott. Canadian consumers and businesses are willingly accepting a degree of economic disruption as the price of sovereignty. It means fewer choices on store shelves, potential supply chain headaches for businesses that rely on U.S. components, and in some cases, paying more for a domestic product. While the Buy Canadian movement has boosted many local producers, it has also forced a rapid, sometimes painful, adjustment across the economy. The movement is a testament to a nation's resolve, but it's a resolve that is tested daily in the quiet transactions of grocery aisles and the balance sheets of small businesses. For Canada, standing up for its identity means bearing the economic friction that comes from pushing back against its largest and most integrated trading partner. Across the border, the consequences of the Canadian boycott are not abstract. They are devastating. For decades, the economies of American border towns were built on a simple, reliable reality: the steady flow of Canadian visitors. These weren't just tourists. They were neighbors, regular shoppers, and the lifeblood of local commerce. When Canada chose to stay home, these communities fell into an economic freefall. From April to September 2025, tourism from Canada to the US plummeted by an almost unbelievable 70%. In border towns, restaurants and duty-free shops reported that business had dropped by 40 to 50%. Upstate New York saw a 21% collapse in border crossings. This isn't a statistic. It's a waitress seeing her shifts cut, a hotel owner facing foreclosure, a main street filled with shuttered storefronts. The scale of the damage is immense. Projections showed that even a sustained 10% reduction in Canadian visitors would cost the US economy $2.1 billion and threaten 140,000 jobs in tourism-related sectors. The actual impact was far worse. The boycott of US spirits, led by Canadian premiers, resulted in a 66% sales crash in a crucial export market. This is the direct blowback from the White House's strategy. The tariffs and rhetoric intended to punish Canada have instead boomeranged, inflicting deep and lasting pain on American small businesses and workers who had nothing to do with the political dispute. It has effectively built an invisible wall, severing the economic and cultural ties that took generations to build. For these American communities, the trade war isn't a distant policy debate in Washington. It's an existential crisis delivered by the sudden, deafening silence from the North. A friendship once the envy of the world has dissolved into a popular consumer revolt. A president's gambit of threat and insult intended to force submission instead ignited a firestorm of national pride and economic defiance from its closest ally. The result is a bitter standoff, with billions in cross-border trade held hostage and deep economic wounds inflicted on both sides. The world's longest undefended border is now a front line of principle over profit. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.